Okay, so today we're going to look at inverse of radical equations, or square root equations actually, and we have looked at inverse before, so it's something we've definitely talked about. So inverse, what does it mean? It essentially means taking a function and switching the domain and range, or switching, sometimes I say, x and y. Okay, it reflects around the line y equals x. Okay, y equals x. And earlier in the year, we did the activity with the painted hands. Do you remember where we did the painted hands and we found their inverse points? So, the steps for algebraically finding inverse are switch x and y and solve for y. Another method that also works great is to do stat in your calculator. So switch x and y here and then do stat. Plug in the new ones. So we'll try a couple of those different methods as we look at these problems. So here we have find the inverse. Now these are linear equations. So we'll do one each way. So the first one would be find the inverse of this first problem. And so if we switch x and y, I get x equals 3y minus 7. And if I solve for y, I'm going to add 7. So x plus 7 equals 3y. Divide by 3. So now y, the inverse y, equals x plus 7 over 3. So that is the inverse. So here was the original, and here is the inverse. Okay, the other method I want to make sure we know how to do is using our calculator. So I put this into y sub 1, and I'm looking at the table. And when I do that, I find that the table I'm going to pick 3 points. So 0, 3, and really you only need to pick 2 points. And I'll do 4, 5. So these are points from this line. So to find the inverse, I'm going to take those points, and what am I going to do with them? I'm going to switch them. So in L1, I'm going to put 3 and 5. In L2, I'm going to put 0 and 4. Okay, so I just took these points and I switched them. So what was in X goes in L2, and what was in Y goes in L1. Okay, so now I'm going to go to stat in my calculator, and in L1, I'm going to put 3 and 5. In L2, I'm going to put 0 and 4. Then I do stat, calc, 4, enter, and I get the equation y equals 2x minus 6. Okay, so that is the inverse of my original question. Okay, so I took the domain and made it become the range, and took the range and made it become the domain. Okay, now when we're finding so those two methods both worked with linear. Now when we're finding quadratic, we need to stick with the algebraic method because of some particular things about the domain and the range. So here we have a quadratic function. The domain of all quadratic functions. Who remembers the domain of all quadratic functions? Yes, it is negative infinity to infinity. Okay, so what's the range of this function? Negative 6 to infinity. Because if I sketch this one, it would look like this. Here, down 6. Okay, so now I need to find the inverse. So I'm going to take this function, switch x and y. Okay, from here, I'm going to add 6. Then I'm going to take the square root. So the inverse is plus or minus the square root of x plus 6. Okay, so this is because I have to do plus or minus, because remember, anytime I take the square root of something, I have to do plus and minus when it's in an equation. So what should be the new domain? Negative 6 to infinity, because it has to switch. What should be the new range? Negative infinity to infinity. So if I were to graph this, it would be a function to the side. like this. Okay? So, is this a function? No, because it does not pass the vertical line test. Okay? So, oh, here's where I'm supposed to draw a sketch of it. So this moves -6, looks like this, not a function. Okay, however, we are sure about our domain and range because this domain becomes this range and this range becomes this domain every single time. So is it a function? No, it's not a function, and that's because this is the plus square root of x plus 6, and this is the minus square root of x plus 6. Okay? So let's try another one. It is a little bit complicated, but we'll try another one. Okay, so the domain of this function. So you might want to draw a little sketch of it or put it in your calculator and see. This one is going to shift to the left 2. So it should look like that. I'm going to double check in my calculator, but give you some time to type it in. So 2x plus 4 squared. Okay, so that's what that function looks like. So the domain is -infinity to infinity, because that's every quadratic function, and the range in this case is 0 to infinity. So I know without even finding the inverse that my domain is now going to be 0 to infinity, and the range is going to be -infinity to infinity. Okay, because it has to be, because that's how inverse works. So first I'm going to switch x and y. So x equals 2y plus 4 squared. Okay, so the first thing I need to do this time is get rid of the squared. So plus or minus x equals 2y plus 4. Then I'm going to subtract 4. So plus or minus the square root of x minus 4 equals 2y, then divide by 2. So the inverse is plus or minus the square root of x minus 4 over 2. Okay? So that's a little bit tricky, but that's what, make sure that only the x is what's inside of the radical. Everything else is on the outside. So in your calculator, there's no way to do a plus or minus, so you just have to do one part of it at a time. So in my calculator, I'm going to type the square root of x, and then close those parentheses, minus 4 divided by 2. And I'm even going to put parentheses around the whole numerator. Okay, and then I'm also going to do minus the square root of x, minus 4 divided by 2. And when I graph it, it's going to look like this. Okay, so once again, is it a function? No, it is not a function because it does not pass the vertical line test. Okay? Okay, let's try a few more. Okay, now this time I'm starting with a square root and I'm going to end with a quadratic. Okay, so the domain of this square root is moving to the left 4, because this means that it shifted left 4. So I know that my domain is going to be -4 to infinity, and my range is going to be 0 to infinity, because it did not move up and down. So you can graph that if you need to double check it, but those are going to be my domain and range. So to find the inverse, switch x and y. Now, how do I get rid of a square root? What's the thing I get rid of a square root? I square it. So x squared equals y plus 4, subtract 4. So the inverse is x squared minus 4. However, what's the domain of every quadratic function? -infinity to infinity. So I need the domain to only be 0 to infinity. So I have to restrict the domain. I have to say, I only want this function to be true from 0 to infinity. So instead of having this whole piece of the function, I only want this half of the function, because if you remember, my square root function looks like this, so I only need half of the function to make the inverse. So I have to say, this is the function, but I only want x to be greater than or equal to 0. I only want 0 to infinity for x. And then the range will be -4 to infinity. So is the inverse a function now? Yes, the inverse is a function. Okay, you're probably going to need to look at that again, and this is probably what you're going to have questions with tomorrow, but I want to make sure you've seen it once and you're ready with your questions. So I'm going to do this last one. This video is kind of long because there's been some calculator stuff. So this one I'm going to do a little bit differently. I'm going to start by graphing the original question. So the original equation is going to move right 2, up 3. Okay, so I'm going to move right 2, up 3. Okay, the range, the domain is 2 to infinity, and the range is 3 to infinity. So, to find the inverse, switch x and y. Solve for y. So add 3, x plus 3 equals the square root of y minus 2. Now how do I get rid of a square root? Square it. So x plus 3 squared equals y minus 2. The last thing I'm going to do is add the 2. So y, the inverse of y is x plus 3 squared plus 2. So that moves the function to the left 3. I'm sorry, this right here should have been right here. I should not have added 3. What should I have done right here? Someone's got it. I should have subtracted 3 in the very beginning. Okay, so I'm going to move to the right 3 and up 2. Now, do I want the whole quadratic or just the half? Just the half. So I want this function over here, but I only want this time when x is greater than or equal to 3, because I only want from 3 over. I don't want this other half, because then it wouldn't be inverse anymore. So I want my domain to be 3 to infinity, and the range to be 2 to infinity. Is the inverse a function? Yes, it passes the vertical line test. So I feel like this last little bit is probably the hardest part, so make sure that you've looked at that a couple of times and you're ready for questions tomorrow. I hope you all have a great evening, and I will see you soon.